In 1621, the Dutch East India Company massacred roughly 90% of the Banda Islands population, somewhere between 13,000 and 15,000 people, to control a crop that grew nowhere else on Earth. The crop was nutmeg. And for nearly 2 centuries, that small archipelago in the eastern Moluccas was the only place in the world where Myristica fragrans, the nutmeg tree, produced its fruit. That fact alone should stop you cold. Not pepper, not gold, not silk, a seed the size of a marble. The Banda Islands sit in the Banda Sea, roughly 2,000 kilometers east of Java. There are 10 of them, and together they cover less than 180 square kilometers of land. Before European contact, the islands had no king, no centralized government, and no standing army. They had orang kaya, literally rich men, a council of local merchants who managed trade with visiting ships. For centuries, those ships came from Java, Malay, and Arabia, loading up nutmeg and mace, the red lace that wraps the nutmeg seed inside its fruit, and carrying them west along routes that most Europeans could not have drawn on a map. What arrived in Europe by the time of the medieval spice trade was nutmeg at a markup of several thousand% over its source price. A pound of nutmeg purchased in the Banda Islands for roughly 1 Dutch stiver might sell in Amsterdam for 300. The traders who bridged that gap, the Arab and Javanese middlemen who kept the source secret for generations, built fortunes on silence. European buyers knew nutmeg came from somewhere called the Spice Islands. They did not know exactly where. They were not meant to. Nutmeg's value in medieval Europe was not primarily culinary. That came later. Its value was medical, and medical in a way that tells you something important about what fear does to markets. European physicians of the 13th and 14th centuries believed nutmeg could ward off plague. When the Black Death reached Europe in 1347 and began killing 1 in 3 people across the continent, demand for nutmeg spiked with a desperation that had nothing to do with taste. People wore pouches of it around their necks. They burned it in their homes. They paid whatever was asked. Nobody could verify whether it worked, and nobody stopped buying it because nobody could afford to assume it did not. That fear-driven demand was already ancient by the time the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean. Nutmeg appears in Arab medical texts from the 9th century. Ibn Sina, writing in the early 11th century, described it as useful for stomach complaints and as a general strengthening agent. In Chinese medicine, it appears in texts from around the same period. In Europe, the 12th century abbess Hildegard of Bingen listed it as a spice that promoted a good temperament when added to food. None of these traditions agreed on what, precisely, nutmeg did. All of them agreed it did something. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to reach the Banda Islands directly. Afonso de Albuquerque took Malacca in 1511, and within months he dispatched 3 ships eastward under Antonio de Abreu to find the source of the spice trade. They arrived in the Bandas in early 1512. The local orang kaya traded with them willingly enough. The Portuguese were not yet numerous enough to threaten anyone, and the Bandanese had no reason to treat them differently from any other visiting merchants. That would change. For the next century, Portugal tried and largely failed to monopolize the nutmeg trade. They built a fort on the island of Bandaneira. They attempted to enforce contracts that required the Bandanese to sell only to them at fixed prices. The Bandanese ignored the contracts when better offers arrived, which they did regularly because Javanese and English and eventually Dutch traders all wanted the same thing. Portugal's problem was distance. Lisbon was 20,000 kilometers from the Banda Islands by sea. Maintaining a military presence capable of real enforcement at that range, with 16th century logistics, was nearly impossible. The spice leaked out. The prices stayed high, but the monopoly stayed theoretical. Then the Dutch arrived, and the Dutch were organized in a way that Portugal never had been. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, The Dutch East India Company received its charter from the States General of the Netherlands in 1602. It was, from its first day, something new. A company with the legal right to wage war, sign treaties, build forts, and govern territories in Asia on behalf of the Dutch Republic. It was not a trading company with a military arm. It was a military and governmental operation that also traded. The distinction mattered enormously in the Banda Islands. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen arrived as the VOC's Governor-General in 1618. Cohen was 31 years old and had already spent years in Asia learning that the VOC's ambitions and its actual control of the nutmeg supply were not the same thing. The Bandanese continued selling to the English. They violated monopoly contracts. They resisted VOC price setting. To Cohen, this was not a trade dispute. It was insubordination that threatened the entire financial architecture the VOC had built around nutmeg. In 1621, Cohen arrived in the Banda Islands with 1,900 soldiers and a group of Japanese mercenaries. What followed was not a military campaign in any conventional sense. It was an extermination. The Orang Kaya, who had negotiated with the Dutch, were executed. Villages were burned. The population that did not die fighting fled into the interior of the islands, where many starved. Others drowned attempting to reach neighboring islands. The VOC's own records, compiled afterward, estimated that of a pre-contact Bandanese population of around 15,000, perhaps 1,000, survived. Cohen then divided the islands into 68 parcels called perken. He gave these parcels to Dutch colonists, called perkeneers, who were required to sell their entire nutmeg harvest to the VOC at a fixed price, use VOC-supplied enslaved labor, and buy all their provisions from VOC stores. The perkeneers could become wealthy within this system, but they could not escape it. The nutmeg trees that had once grown in a functioning Bandanese economy now grew in a plantation economy built on coerced labor, with every link in the chain controlled by a single company in Amsterdam. For a few decades, this worked exactly as Cohen intended. The VOC's nutmeg monopoly was genuine. Prices in Europe stayed high. The company paid its shareholders annual dividends that sometimes reached 40%. Nutmeg, mace, and cloves funded the Dutch Golden Age, which was not only the period of Rembrandt and Vermeer, but also the period of Amsterdam's explosive growth from a modest port to the financial capital of the world. The spice trade built the Herengracht. It funded the great Dutch trading houses. It paid for the ships that kept the whole system running. What the VOC could not control was the English. The English had their own East India Company, formed 2 years before the Dutch one, and while England lost the Banda Islands after a brief occupation in the early 1600s, it held one small island there called Run. Run was tiny, barely 3 kilometers long, but it had nutmeg trees, and the English refused to give it up. For decades, it became a point of contention that escalated into open conflict. In 1667, the two countries finally settled the matter in the Treaty of Breda. England gave up Run. The Dutch gave England a small, unimpressive trading post on the eastern coast of North America that the English had seized from them 3 years earlier. That trading post was called New Amsterdam. The English renamed it New York. It is worth sitting with that trade for a moment. The island of Manhattan, the trading hub that would become one of the wealthiest cities in human history, was exchanged for a nutmeg island so small you can walk its length in under an hour. In Amsterdam, the exchange seemed reasonable. Run had nutmeg trees. Manhattan had beaver pelts and some strategic harbors. The VOC's directors understood the value of monopoly over a scarce commodity in a way they did not yet understand the value of a North American port. They made the trade with confidence. 3 centuries later, the mathematics of that decision are genuinely staggering. The monopoly that made Run seem worth Manhattan began to collapse almost immediately after the treaty that secured it. The mechanism of collapse was simple. The VOC burned nutmeg harvests to keep prices up when supply exceeded demand. It executed anyone caught trying to remove nutmeg plants or seeds from the islands. It maintained naval patrols to intercept unauthorized traders. Every one of these measures was effective in the short term and ultimately futile in the long term, because living things move in ways that commodity prices cannot. Pierre Poivre was a French botanist and administrator who spent decades trying to break the Dutch spice monopoly. He made multiple voyages to the Banda Islands and neighboring areas between the 1750s and 1770s, smuggling nutmeg and clove seedlings to French-controlled Mauritius and later to Réunion. His efforts were only partially successful at first. Many seedlings died in transit. Some of the plants he acquired were deliberately damaged by Dutch agents. Poivre kept trying. By the time he left Mauritius in 1773, nutmeg plants were growing in French colonial soil for the first time. The British completed what Poivre started. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain occupied the Banda Islands between 1810 and 1817. Thomas Stamford Raffles, who governed much of the Dutch colonial territory on behalf of Britain during those years, systematically transplanted nutmeg seedlings to Penang, Bencoolen, and eventually Singapore. When the Dutch recovered the Banda Islands in 1817, they recovered an archipelago whose botanical monopoly had already been broken. Nutmeg trees were now growing in Penang, in Mauritius, in Grenada. The wall that 15,000 Bandanese people had died to maintain, that the VOC had spent 170 years enforcing with fire and execution, had been dismantled by a botanist with a collection bag and enough patience to keep trying after the first failures. The price of nutmeg in Europe fell steadily through the 19th century as new plantations matured and competition drove margins down. The Banda Islands, depopulated by the 1621 massacre and then repopulated with enslaved workers and Dutch colonists, continued producing nutmeg, but no longer dominated the market. The Perkineers, whose fortunes had once rested on VOC-enforced exclusivity, found themselves farming a commodity that anyone could now grow in the right climate. The plantation system that replaced the Bandanese economy produced nutmeg for a century and a half, then gradually became irrelevant as production shifted elsewhere. Grenada today is the world's second largest producer of nutmeg after Indonesia. That fact requires a moment of geographic orientation. Grenada is a Caribbean island, roughly 160 kilometers north of Venezuela. It has no ancient relationship with nutmeg, no tradition, no indigenous knowledge, no cultural history with the spice. Nutmeg arrived there in 1843, carried by the British from their Asian colonial territories. Within a few decades, it was the island's most important export crop. Grenadians call their country the Isle of Spice. The nutmeg appears on their national flag, a red seed on a yellow stripe. A plant that grew only in 10 small islands in the Banda Sea for the entirety of human history until the 18th century now defines the national identity of a Caribbean island that the Bandanese people never knew existed. Indonesia remains the largest producer. The Banda Islands still grow nutmeg. The trees there are descendants of the same Myristica fragrans groves that the Orankaya tended before Cohen arrived. The archipelago now has a population of around 20,000 people, none of them descendants of the original Bandanese, who were entirely replaced. There is a fort on Bandanera still, Fort Belgica, built by the Dutch in 1611. Tourists visit it. The village below the fort is quiet. The VOC itself collapsed in 1799, dissolved by the Dutch government after decades of corruption, mismanagement, and the compounding costs of maintaining a military-commercial empire across Asia. It had paid those extraordinary dividends in its peak decades by borrowing against future profits, a practice that worked precisely as long as the monopolies held. When the monopolies broke, The borrowing caught up with everything. The company that had murdered a civilization to control a seed declared bankruptcy 178 years after its founding. Nutmeg's medical reputation did not survive contact with actual pharmacology. The properties that medieval physicians attributed to it, plague prevention, general fortification, stomach remedies, could not be demonstrated under any controlled conditions because they did not exist in any consistent form. What nutmeg does contain, in large quantities, is myristicin, a compound that at sufficient doses is a potent hallucinogen, and at higher doses is toxic. The nutmeg poisonings documented in 19th and 20th century medical literature came mostly from people who had read about myristicin and were attempting to use nutmeg as a drug. The doses required to produce hallucinogenic effects are unpleasant enough, involving nausea and disorientation lasting hours, that nutmeg never developed a recreational following. Its danger is mostly accidental from people who did not know what they were taking. The spice that killed 15,000 people to protect a monopoly is now ground into eggnog and bechamel sauce. A jar of it costs less than €2 in any German supermarket. The entire chain of events from the Bandanese Orankaya to the VOC massacre to Poivre's smuggled seedlings to Grenada's national flag produced this: a spice rack ingredient bought without thought, used in small quantities to season milk-based sauces, utterly ordinary. What the nutmeg trade produced that was not ordinary was a template. The VOC's methods in the Banda Islands, extermination of the existing population, replacement with coerced labor, enforced monoculture, price controls maintained by military violence, were replicated across Southeast Asia, across the Caribbean, across Africa, across the Americas. The Banda Islands were not the first place this happened. They were one of the first places it happened with such complete and documented efficiency that the VOC used them as a model. Cohen cited the Banda operation in his correspondence with the VOC directors as proof that the method worked. The directors agreed. The 17th century produced no international law capable of trying Cohen for what he did. The 21st century has the legal frameworks but not the jurisdiction, since Cohen died in Batavia in 1629, 10 years after the massacre of cholera. There is a statue of him in Hoorn, the Dutch city where he was born. The statue has been the subject of recurring public debate in the Netherlands, particularly after 2020, when statues of colonial figures became contested across Europe and North America. As of mid-2026, the statue remains in place. A plaque was added acknowledging the violence of Cohen's actions in Asia. The plaque is smaller than the statue.